The black SUV pulled up to the ABC studios just after 7 in the morning. Inside, Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the back seat, watching the city wake up through tinted windows. He'd been up since 5, not because he had to be, but because that's just how his body worked these days. Years of early call times and motorcycle rides at dawn had trained him to rise with the sun. His phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time that morning. Text messages from friends wishing him luck. Emails from his team going over last-minute talking points. A voice note from his co-star telling him to have fun and not take it too seriously. Keanu smiled at that one. Fun. Right. Talk shows had never been his thing, but this was part of the job. Part of the dance everyone did when a new movie came out. The driver opened his door and Keanu stepped out onto the sidewalk. A small group of fans had already gathered near the entrance, somehow knowing he'd be there despite no official announcement. He stopped without being asked, signing autographs and taking selfies with anyone who wanted one. A young woman told him his movies had helped her through a difficult time. An older man said he'd been a fan since the beginning. Keanu thanked them both with genuine warmth in his voice, making eye contact with each person like they were the only one there. Inside the building, a production assistant met him in the lobby. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and clearly nervous about escorting one of Hollywood's biggest stars. She kept apologizing for things that didn't need apologies, like the walk to the green room being longer than expected or the coffee not being ready yet. Keanu put her at ease the way he always did, asking about her day and whether she'd had breakfast yet. The green room was exactly like every other green room he'd ever been in. Comfortable couches, a mirror surrounded by lights, a table loaded with snacks and drinks that no one ever really touched. His publicist was already there, pacing while talking on her phone. She'd been with him for almost a decade now, and he trusted her completely. When she hung up, she gave him that look, the one that said she was about to tell him something he probably wouldn't love. "So I just got off with their producer," she said, sitting down next to him. "They want to keep it light and fun. Career stuff, the new movie. Maybe some behind-the-scenes stories from set." Keanu nodded. That sounded fine. Standard stuff. "But you know how Joy can be," she continued, and there it was. The warning. She likes to dig a little deeper sometimes. Push buttons. Gets ratings. He'd heard stories about Joy Behar, everyone had. She was known for being direct, sometimes brutally so. But he'd also heard she could be funny and engaging when she wanted to be. It was a live show, anything could happen. That was part of what made it interesting, he supposed. "I'll be fine," he told his publicist. And he meant it. He'd done hundreds of interviews over the years. He knew how to deflect uncomfortable questions without being rude, how to laugh things off, how to protect the parts of his life that mattered most while still being gracious to the people asking the questions. A makeup artist came in to do a quick touch-up. Keanu sat still while she worked, grateful for the few quiet minutes. He thought about the movie he was there to promote. The months of training, the bruises, the early mornings and late nights. He genuinely loved the project and the people he'd worked with. That would make talking about it easier. Through the walls, he could hear the muffled sound of the show's opening, music and applause, the familiar rhythm of daytime television. A stage manager knocked on the door and told him they'd come get him in about 15 minutes. Keanu thanked her and took a sip of water. His publicist was back on her phone, putting out some fire or another. It never stopped in this business. The 15 minutes passed quickly. Another production assistant, this one older and more relaxed, appeared at the door with a smile. "Ready?" she asked. Keanu stood up, straightened his jacket, and followed her down a hallway lined with photos of past guests and memorable moments from the show's long history. He recognized faces of friends, colleagues, people he'd worked with over the years. Backstage was controlled chaos. People rushing in different directions with clipboards and headsets. Camera operators checking their equipment. Stagehands adjusting lights. Everyone had a job and everyone knew exactly what they were doing. The production assistant led him to a spot just off stage where he could see the hosts at their table, but the audience couldn't see him yet. He watched them wrap up their opening segment. There was energy between them, a chemistry built over years of working together. They teased each other and laughed at inside jokes the audience seemed to be part of. Whoopi Goldberg commanded the table with natural authority. Sarah Haynes smiled warmly while making a point about something in the news. Alyssa Farah Griffin nodded in agreement. Sunny Hostin added her perspective. and Joy Behar cracked a joke that got a big laugh from the crowd. A commercial break was called. The stage manager looked at Keanu and held up 5 fingers. 5 minutes. His heart rate picked up slightly, the way it always did before stepping into the spotlight. Not fear exactly, but anticipation, awareness, the knowledge that millions of people would be watching, judging, forming opinions based on a few minutes of conversation. He rolled his shoulders back and took a deep breath. The stage manager counted down. 3, 2, 1. The cameras went live again. He heard his name announced, heard the audience cheer. The music swelled. This was it. Keanu walked onto the set with that familiar modest smile, waving to the audience like he was genuinely happy to see them. And in that moment he was. These were people who'd supported his work for decades, who'd bought tickets to his movies and made his career possible. The least he could do was show up and be present for a few minutes of their day. He made his way down the line of hosts, shaking hands and exchanging quick greetings. Whoopi gave him a warm hug. The others welcomed him with genuine smiles. Joy's handshake lasted just a beat longer than the others, her eyes studying his face with interest. He settled into the guest chair, adjusting the microphone clip to his jacket. The interview began exactly as promised. Easy questions about the new film. Clips played on monitors showing him doing incredible stunts. The audience oohed and awed in the right places. He told a funny story about nearly crashing a motorcycle during a particularly difficult scene. Everyone laughed. He complimented his co-stars and director, talked about how much preparation went into the action sequences. Whoopi asked him about his production company and the kinds of stories he wanted to tell. That was a question he loved because it let him talk about the work itself, the craft, the collaboration with talented people. He spoke about giving opportunities to new directors and finding scripts that had something meaningful to say. For those first 20 minutes, everything went exactly as it should have. The conversation flowed naturally. The host seemed genuinely interested. The audience was engaged. Keanu started to relax into it, remembering why he'd agreed to do the show in the first place. It was actually kind of nice sitting there talking about something he loved with people who seemed to care. But then he noticed Joy leaning forward slightly, that look in her eye, the one his publicist had warned him about, the one that said she was about to take the conversation somewhere else entirely, somewhere he might not want to go. He kept his smile in place and waited to see what would come next. Joy shifted in her seat, and Keanu could feel the energy at the table change. It was subtle, but it was there. The kind of shift that happens when someone's about to change direction in a conversation, when they're done with the warm-up and ready to get into what they really want to talk about. So, Keanu, Joy started, her voice carrying that particular tone interviewers use when they think they're about to ask something provocative. You've been in this business for what, almost 40 years now? He nodded, not sure where this was going, but willing to follow for now. Something like that, yeah. And in all that time, you've managed to keep your private life incredibly private. I mean, most actors your age, we know everything about them. Every relationship, every breakup, every scandal. She laughed, and a few people in the audience laughed with her. But you're like a mystery wrapped in an enigma. Keanu smiled politely. I just prefer to keep work and personal life separate. Seems healthier that way. But don't you think your fans deserve to know the real you? Joy pressed. I mean, they've supported you all these years. They've made you who you are, there it was. The first uncomfortable moment. Keanu had heard variations of this argument countless times. The idea that fame came with an obligation to surrender privacy, that success meant owing strangers access to every corner of your life. He'd never agreed with it, and he wasn't about to start now. I think my fans know me through my work, he said carefully. That's the part of myself I choose to share. The rest is just for me and the people I care about. Whoopi jumped in, seeming to sense the tension building. I think that's fair. Not everyone wants to live their whole life in public. But Joy wasn't ready to let it go. Okay, but come on. You've had some pretty significant relationships over the years. People are curious. Is there someone special in your life right now? The audience made those encouraging noises crowds make when they want someone to spill personal details. Keanu's smile tightened just slightly at the corners. He'd been asked about his love life a million times before. Usually he gave some version of the same diplomatic non-answer and the interviewer moved on. But something about Joy's tone suggested she wasn't planning to move on easily. I'm happy, he said simply. That's really all that matters, isn't it? Oh, come on, Joy said, leaning even further forward. That's not an answer. Are you seeing anyone? Are you single? Give us something here. Sarah Haynes looked uncomfortable. Sonny Hostin glanced at the producers off camera. Even the audience seemed split between those who wanted him to answer and those who could feel this was getting weird. Keanu took a breath. I think what I do on screen is public. Who I spend time with off screen is private. I hope people can respect that. His voice was still kind, still measured, but anyone paying attention could hear the boundary being drawn. This was him saying, gently but clearly, that he didn't want to go down this road. Most interviewers would have picked up on that and shifted gears. Most would have respected the line he was drawing. Joy was not most interviewers. You know what I think? She said, her voice taking on that gossipy quality. I think you're private because you've been hurt. And I get that, I really do. You've had some real tragedies in your life. The temperature in the room dropped. You could feel it. The other hosts went very still. The audience stopped making noise. Even the crew members standing off to the side seemed to freeze. Keanu's face didn't change much, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something that looked like warning. We all deal with loss, he said quietly. It's part of being human. But your losses have been particularly devastating, Joy continued, and Keanu couldn't believe she was actually doing this. I mean, your girlfriend losing the baby and then her passing. That's heavy stuff. That changes a person. She said it like she was being sympathetic, like she was acknowledging his pain, but there was something else underneath it. Something that felt more like she was using his trauma as setup for whatever question was coming next. Using the worst moments of his life as entertainment for a daytime talk show. Keanu's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, gripped slightly. Those are private matters, he said, his voice lower now. I don't talk about them publicly. I respect that, Joy said, though her actions suggested otherwise. But don't you think talking about grief and loss could help other people? I mean, you're not the only one who's experienced tragedy. Maybe sharing your experience could make someone else feel less alone. It was a clever move, framing invasive questions as altruism, suggesting that his privacy was somehow selfish, that he owed it to strangers to dissect the most painful parts of his life on television. Keanu looked at her for a long moment. There are grief counselors for that. Support groups. People trained to help. I'm an actor. I make movies. That's what I'm here to talk about. He was being more direct now, the politeness still there but wearing thin. Whoopi tried to jump in again with a question about his motorcycle company, clearly attempting to redirect. But Joy talked right over her. Okay, fair enough, Joy said, though her tone suggested she didn't actually think it was fair at all. Let's talk about something lighter then. You've been spotted around town with someone recently. There are photos. So clearly you're not as private as you claim to be. The audience made interested noises again. This was what they'd come for, after all. The gossip. The details. The peek behind the curtain of someone who'd spent decades keeping that curtain firmly closed. Keanu's expression hardened. If there are photos, they were taken without permission. That doesn't make my life public property. But you're a public figure, Joy countered. That's the deal, isn't it? Fame comes with a price. The price is judgment about my work, opinions about the movies I make, not surveillance of my personal relationships. His voice was still controlled, still even, but anyone watching could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was sitting straighter in his chair. The way his characteristic warmth had been replaced by something more guarded. Sarah tried to lighten things up with a joke about paparazzi being everywhere. Alyssa asked a question about his next project, but Joy kept circling back like a dog with a bone it wouldn't drop. Look, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Joy said. We all want to know who Keanu Reeves is when he's not being Keanu Reeves, the movie star. What makes you happy? What breaks your heart? Who do you love? Why? Keanu asked simply. The question seemed to catch Joy off guard. What do you mean, why? Why do you need to know those things? Why does anyone need to know? I show up, I do my job, I try to be kind to people. Isn't that enough? It's just curiosity, Joy said, sounding defensive now. People are interested in you. Being interested doesn't create entitlement, Keanu replied. I appreciate that people enjoy my work. I really do. But my personal life isn't content for consumption. The audience was completely silent now. This had gone from uncomfortable to genuinely tense. The producers were probably freaking out, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let it play out. The other hosts looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Joy laughed, but it sounded forced. Wow, okay. Didn't mean to hit a nerve. You did mean to, Keanu said quietly. That was the whole point of these questions. To push until I got uncomfortable. To get a reaction. Well, here's the reaction. I think people deserve privacy. I think tragedy isn't entertainment. And I think kindness includes respecting boundaries when someone sets them. Whoopi nodded in agreement. That's fair, Keanu, that's absolutely fair. But Joy wasn't done. Maybe she felt challenged. Maybe she was frustrated that he wasn't playing along. Maybe she genuinely didn't understand why he was upset. Whatever the reason, she decided to push one more time. Okay, last question on this topic and then we'll move on, she said. This person you're seeing now, is it serious? Are we going to hear wedding bells? And that was the moment. The moment when Keanu's patience finally ran out. Not explosively, not dramatically, but completely. His hand moved to the microphone clipped to his jacket. His face was calm, but his eyes were done. Just done with the questions, with the pushing, with being treated like his pain and his love and his life were toys for someone else to play with on television. I think we're done here, he said softly. Joy laughed nervously. What? Come on, I was just asking. But Keanu was already unclipping the microphone from his jacket. Already starting to stand up. The other hosts looked shocked. The audience gasped. Somewhere off camera, a producer was probably having a heart attack. This was actually happening. Keanu Reeves, one of the nicest men in Hollywood, was walking out of an interview, and somehow, even in that moment, even as he was leaving, he managed to maintain his dignity and grace. For a few seconds, nobody moved. It was like the whole studio had been frozen in time. Keanu stood there with the microphone in his hand, no longer attached to his jacket. The audience sat in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling because nobody had told them to stop, and the hosts at the table just stared, trying to process what was happening. Joy was the first to recover. Oh, come on, Keanu, don't be like that. We're just having a conversation here. But the way she said it, the dismissive tone, the attempt to make him seem unreasonable for having boundaries, that only confirmed what Keanu already knew. This wasn't a conversation. It was an interrogation dressed up as entertainment. And he was done being interrogated. No, he said simply. We're not having a conversation. You're pushing for information I've made clear I don't want to share. That's not a conversation. That's something else entirely. He set the microphone down on the arm of his chair, carefully, the way he did everything. There was no throwing it. No dramatic gesture. Just a quiet, deliberate action that spoke volumes about his state of mind. He was disappointed, not angry. Tired, not aggressive. And somehow that made it even more powerful. Whoopi stood up, her hand slightly raised like she was trying to mediate a situation that was rapidly spiraling. Keanu, I think we can move on to something else. We've got some clips from the movie we haven't shown yet. He looked at her with genuine appreciation. Whoopi had always been kind to him in their past interactions. She'd always seemed to understand that being famous didn't mean surrendering your humanity. But even her attempt to salvage this couldn't fix what had already been broken. I appreciate that, he told her. I really do. But I think the damage is done here. Sunny spoke up, her voice professional but sympathetic. We didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Sometimes the conversation just goes in unexpected directions. Keanu nodded. I understand. But the thing is, this wasn't unexpected. This was deliberate. And I'm choosing not to participate in it anymore. The audience was starting to murmur now. Some people looked uncomfortable, like they felt secondhand embarrassment for witnessing this. Others seemed thrilled, probably already thinking about how they'd describe this moment to their friends later. A few people actually looked angry, though whether they were angry at Joy for pushing or at Keanu for not playing along was hard to tell. Sarah Haynes tried a different approach. What if we just reset, start fresh with questions about the movie? Keanu smiled at her, but it was a sad smile. I think we're past that point. And honestly, I'm not sure I trust that we wouldn't end up right back here. Joy threw her hands up. Okay, I get it. I pushed too hard. I apologize. Can we please just finish the interview? But here's the thing about apologies that are only given because you got caught doing something wrong. They don't carry much weight. An apology should come from understanding why you hurt someone and genuinely feeling bad about it. This apology sounded more like frustration that her interview subject wasn't cooperating, that she was losing control of her segment, that this wasn't going the way she'd planned. Keanu heard that in her voice. Everyone did. I appreciate the apology, he said, and he probably meant it on some level. Keanu wasn't someone who held grudges or needed to prove points. But I think it's better if I go. A producer finally appeared from offstage, a woman with a headset and a stressed expression that suggested she'd been watching all of this unfold from the control room and trying to figure out what to do. She approached Keanu with her hand slightly raised in a placating gesture. Mr. Reeves, please. We can take a quick break, regroup, figure this out. He looked at her with that same calm expression he'd maintained through this whole ordeal. There's nothing to figure out. I came here to talk about my work. I was clear about my boundaries. Those boundaries weren't respected. So I'm leaving. That's not complicated. The logic was simple and undeniable. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd shown up, been professional, tried to redirect multiple times when the questions became invasive. He'd drawn clear lines, and those lines had been crossed repeatedly. At what point was a person allowed to say enough? For Keanu, that point was now. He started to move toward the edge of the stage. The cameras followed him because of course they did. This was going to be the moment everyone talked about. Not his movie. Not his stunts. Not the thoughtful things he'd said about his work. This moment right here, when one of Hollywood's kindest actors had finally reached his limit, Joy called out to him. This is live television, Keanu. You're really going to walk out on live television? He paused and turned back to face her. For just a moment, there was something in his expression that made you realize this man had probably wanted to walk out of 100 uncomfortable situations over the years, but hadn't. Because he was professional, because he was kind, because he understood that sometimes you put up with things you don't like because it's part of the job, but there's a difference between putting up with awkward questions and allowing yourself to be treated as if your trauma is entertainment. There's a difference between being gracious and being a doormat, and Keanu had found that line. Yes, he said simply. I am. Alyssa Farrah Griffin, who'd been mostly quiet through all of this, finally spoke. Joy, maybe you should have backed off when he asked you to. It was said diplomatically, but everyone heard what she was really saying. This is your fault. You did this. You pushed someone who didn't deserve to be pushed, and now we're all dealing with the consequences. Joy's face flushed. Whether from embarrassment or anger or some combination of both, it was hard to tell. I was just doing my job. Asking questions. That's what we do here. There's asking questions and there's being invasive, Whoopi said quietly, and I think we crossed into the second one. The fact that her own co-hosts were essentially siding with Keanu, or at least acknowledging that things had gone too far, seemed to sink in for Joy. Her expression shifted from defensive to something more uncertain. Like maybe she was starting to realize this wasn't playing out the way she'd expected. Keanu had reached the edge of the stage now. He could see his publicist standing in the wings, her phone already out, probably preparing to do damage control or arrange their exit or both. She looked stressed but not surprised. Like she'd known something like this could happen when they agreed to do the show. The audience was fully engaged now, watching every movement. Some people had their phones out, recording despite the no recording policy. This was going to be all over social media within minutes. Everyone in that studio knew it. The question was what story would be told. Would it be entitled Celebrity Walks Out because he was asked personal questions? Or would it be Decent Man Refuses to Have His Pain Exploited for Ratings? Keanu turned back to the stage one more time. He looked at each of the hosts, his gaze settling last on Joy. And when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of that studio. I've lost people I loved. I've had my heart broken in ways that changed me forever. And I've chosen to keep that private not because I'm hiding, but because some pain is too deep to be put on display. Some memories are too precious to be picked apart for entertainment. And some parts of your life should just be yours. He paused, making sure they were really hearing him. You can ask me about my work. You can ask me about my opinions on things. You can even ask me tough questions about decisions I've made in my career. But my grief, my love, the people who matter most to me, those aren't on the table. Not for you. Not for anyone. The silence that followed was profound. Even Joy seemed to have nothing to say. Keanu had just articulated something that resonated in that room and would resonate with millions of people watching at home. The idea that fame doesn't erase your right to private pain, that success doesn't mean you owe strangers access to your heart. Kindness costs nothing, he said, and those words would be quoted in hundreds of articles and social media posts in the days to come. And some stories aren't yours to tell. They're mine, and I'm keeping them. With that, he walked off the stage, not running, not storming off, just walking with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. His publicist met him in the wings, and together they disappeared down the hallway, leaving behind a studio full of people trying to figure out what had just happened. Back on stage, the hosts sat in uncomfortable silence. The producer was in their ears, probably telling them to go to commercial. But for a few more seconds, they just sat there, processing, realizing that this moment had become bigger than any of them had anticipated. Finally, Whoopi spoke to the camera. "We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll have more of The View." The familiar music played. The lights shifted. The audience started talking among themselves, their voices creating a buzz of speculation and opinion. And somewhere in the building, Keanu Reeves was taking off his visitor badge and heading for the door, ready to leave this whole experience behind him. The hallway felt longer walking out than it had walking in. Keanu moved through the maze of corridors with his publicist beside him, both of them silent. Staff members pressed themselves against walls to let them pass, their eyes wide. Everyone suddenly very interested in their clipboards and phones. Word had already spread through the building. The kind of whispered frenzy that happens when something unprecedented occurs. His publicist finally spoke as they rounded a corner. "That's going to be everywhere in about 5 minutes." Keanu nodded. He knew, of course he knew, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two different things. His heart was pounding in a way it hadn't during the actual confrontation. The adrenaline was catching up to him now that he was away from the cameras. "Did I overreact?" he asked quietly. She stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "No, absolutely not. You set boundaries multiple times." She ignored them. "You had every right to leave." They started moving again, passing production photos on the walls. Decades of television history. Hundreds of guests who'd sat in that same chair, answered questions, promoted their projects, and left without incident. Keanu would be remembered differently. He'd be the one who walked out. The one who said no. Part of him hated that. He'd spent his whole career trying to stay out of drama, avoiding controversy, just doing the work and being kind to people. But another part of him, a part that was growing stronger with each step away from that studio, felt something else. Relief. Pride, even. He'd stood up for himself in a way he hadn't always done before. They reached the green room where he'd waited before the show. It felt like years ago instead of an hour. His jacket was still hanging on the back of a chair. A bottle of water sat half empty on the table, evidence of the person he'd been before everything changed. "I need to call the studio," his publicist said, meaning the movie studio. The people who'd arranged this appearance as part of the promotional tour. The executives who were probably already seeing clips online and panicking about how this would affect the film's marketing campaign. "Let me do it," Keanu said. "This was my choice. I should explain it." She looked uncertain but nodded and handed him her phone with the number already dialed. The executive answered on the second ring, and Keanu could hear the tension in his voice immediately. "What happened?" Keanu explained it calmly, factually, without embellishment. The personal questions, the boundaries he'd set, the continued pushing, his decision to leave. Through it all, the executive stayed quiet, listening. When Keanu finished, there was a pause. "Then honestly, good for you. I mean, yes, this is going to be a headache for the PR team, but good for you. Nobody should have to sit there and be interrogated about their personal trauma on live television." The relief Keanu felt at those words surprised him. He'd half expected anger or disappointment. Instead, he got understanding. "Maybe even respect. We'll handle it," the executive continued. "Put out a statement, work with your team. The movie will be fine. You might actually come out of this looking even better, if we play it right." They talked for a few more minutes about logistics and strategy. When Keanu hung up, his publicist was already typing furiously on her own phone, crafting the statement they'd need to release, managing the narrative before it got away from them completely. "Twitter's exploding," she said without looking up. "Team Keanu is trending. So is Joy's name, but not for good reasons." Keanu sat down on the couch, suddenly tired. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the kind of exhaustion that comes from emotional confrontation. He wasn't someone who enjoyed conflict. Even when he was justified, even when he was right, it still took something out of him. A soft knock on the door made them both look up. It opened slowly, and Whoopi Goldberg stepped inside. She looked concerned, her usual confident demeanor softened by something that looked like genuine care. "Can I come in?" Keanu stood immediately. "Of course." Whoopi closed the door behind her and looked at him with kind eyes. "I wanted to apologize. That shouldn't have happened. Joy was out of line. You tried to redirect several times," Keanu said. "I noticed. I appreciated it. Not hard enough, apparently." She sighed. "Look, I've been doing this a long time. I know where the line is. Joy knows too. She just chooses to cross it sometimes because she thinks it makes for better television. Usually people just laugh it off or deflect. But you stood your ground, and honestly, I respect that." They talked for a few minutes more. Whoopi shared her own experiences with invasive interviews, the times she'd wanted to walk out but didn't, the regret she sometimes felt about not setting firmer boundaries earlier in her career. It was the kind of honest conversation that rarely happens in this business, and Keanu found himself grateful for it. "The internet's going to have opinions," Whoopi warned as she prepared to leave. "People always do, but I think you'll find most of them are on your side." After she left, Keanu and his publicist made their way to the car. The small crowd of fans from earlier had grown. Word must have spread that something dramatic had happened. As soon as Keanu appeared, phones went up. Questions were shouted. Everyone wanted to know what happened, why he left, what Joy had said. He paused before getting into the car. Not because he wanted to make a statement, but because these were people who genuinely cared about him and his work. They deserved acknowledgement. "Thank you all for your support," he said simply. "I appreciate you being here." Someone called out, "You did the right thing." Another voice, "We love you, Keanu." He smiled, waved, and got into the car. As they pulled away from the curb, he watched the building recede in the side mirror. ABC Studios, where he'd just had one of the most uncomfortable hours of his professional life, where he'd also perhaps done something important. His phone started buzzing. Text messages from friends who'd seen what happened. Calls from other members of his team wanting to discuss strategy. Emails from journalists requesting comment. The machine was already in motion, churning this into news, into content, into controversy. But inside the car, it was quiet. His publicist had stopped typing for a moment and was just sitting there looking thoughtful. "You know what's interesting?" she said. "In all the years I've worked with you, I've never seen you do anything like that. You're always so accommodating, always willing to give one more interview, answer one more question, take one more photo." Keanu looked out the window at the city passing by. Maybe that's been the problem. She considered that. Maybe. Or maybe you just finally ran into someone who pushed hard enough to find your limit. Everyone has one, even you. They drove in silence for a while. Keanu thought about all the other times he'd been uncomfortable in interviews but pushed through. Questions about his private life, his past, his relationships. He'd always found ways to deflect or redirect without making a scene. But something about today had been different. Maybe it was the public nature of it, the live television aspect. Maybe it was the specific topics Joy had chosen. Or maybe it was just that after decades of being endlessly patient and accommodating, something in him had finally said, "Enough." His phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his older sister. He answered, and her voice came through immediately, warm and concerned. "I just saw what happened. Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said, and realized he meant it. "Yeah, I'm actually okay." They talked for a few minutes. She told him she was proud of him for standing up for himself, that their family had always valued privacy and dignity, and he'd honored that today. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is say no. By the time he hung up, they were pulling up to his house. The gate opened, and the car slid through into the driveway. Home, privacy, safety, all the things that had been violated in small and large ways during that interview. His publicist turned to him before he got out. "The statement's ready to go. Want to see it before I send it?" He read it quickly. It was perfect, professional, striking the right balance between explaining his position and not throwing unnecessary shade at anyone. It acknowledged the situation without dwelling on it. It was gracious while being firm. "Send it," he said. And just like that, his side of the story would be out there. Not the whole story maybe, but enough. Enough for people to understand that this wasn't a tantrum or a diva moment. It was a boundary, a line, a decision to prioritize his humanity over his career, even if just for one morning. He went inside, kicked off his shoes, and stood in his living room feeling strange. The morning had started normally enough. Now he was at the center of what would probably be the biggest entertainment story of the day. How had that happened? How had a simple talk show appearance turned into this? But he knew how. He'd reached his breaking point, and instead of smiling through it like he'd done 1,000 times before, he'd honored it. He'd listened to the voice inside that said this isn't okay, and he'd acted on it. The question now was what came next. The video was everywhere within 30 minutes. Someone in the audience had recorded the whole thing on their phone despite the rules against it. Others had captured different angles. The clips multiplied across social media like digital wildfire. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, every platform lit up with the footage and the opinions that came with it. Keanu didn't watch them. He'd lived it once already, that was enough. But his publicist kept him updated on the general sentiment, and it was overwhelmingly in his favor. People weren't just supporting him, they were celebrating him. Finally, the headlines read, "Someone stood up to invasive interview tactics." Finally, someone reminded the world that famous people are still people. The hashtag #RespectKeanu started trending worldwide within an hour. Then kindness costs nothing, a direct quote from what he'd said on his way out. People shared their own stories of having boundaries violated, of being pushed to answer personal questions they didn't want to answer, of feeling like they owed strangers explanations about their private pain. It was bigger than just a celebrity walking out of an interview. It had touched something raw and real in people. The conversation expanded beyond Keanu to broader questions about privacy, consent, and the relationship between public figures and the public. Think pieces started appearing online before the show had even finished airing. Cultural commentators weighed in. Psychologists discussed boundaries. Trauma experts talked about the harm of forcing people to relive painful experiences for entertainment. Joy Behar's social media mentions became a flood of criticism. People called her insensitive, invasive, disrespectful. Some went too far, as internet mobs always do, saying cruel things that had nothing to do with what had actually happened. That part bothered Keanu when he heard about it. He hadn't walked out to start a pile-on. He'd walked out because he needed to, for himself. By that evening, ABC released a statement. It was carefully worded, expressing respect for Keanu while not explicitly criticizing Joy. They acknowledged that the interview had taken an unfortunate turn and reiterated their commitment to respectful dialogue with all guests. It was the kind of statement corporations make when they're trying to address a problem without admitting fault. Behind the scenes, though, people close to the network said there were serious conversations happening about interview protocols, about how far hosts should push, about the difference between compelling television and exploitative television. The Keanu incident, as it was being called, had forced a reckoning that was probably long overdue. His co-stars from the movie started speaking out, not because they were asked to, but because they wanted to. One by one, they posted messages supporting him, talking about what a professional he was on set, how kind he'd been to everyone from the director to the crew members, how he'd always treated people with dignity and expected the same in return. Other celebrities chimed in too. People who'd never even worked with Keanu, but who respected what he'd done. Actors who'd been in similar situations and wished they'd had the courage to walk away. Directors who'd seen him be gracious in countless uncomfortable press situations over the years. The support kept building, wave after wave of it. On the second day, Joy Behar addressed the situation on The View. The show opened with her sitting at the table looking more subdued than usual. The other hosts were there, but this was clearly Joy's segment to handle. "I want to talk about what happened with Keanu Reeves," she began. "First, I want to apologize to him directly. I pushed too hard. I asked questions that crossed a line, and I didn't back off when he made it clear he was uncomfortable. That was wrong." She paused, and you could see she was choosing her words carefully. "I've been doing this job for a long time, and sometimes I think I know where the boundaries are, but clearly I misjudged them this time. Keanu has been through real loss and real pain, and he has every right to keep that private. I shouldn't have brought it up, and I definitely shouldn't have kept pushing when he asked me not to." It was a good apology, better than the hasty one she'd tried to give during the actual interview. This one felt more genuine, more thought out, like she'd actually reflected on what happened and understood why it was wrong. I think we all need to do better, she continued, me included. Maybe especially me. There's a difference between asking tough questions and being invasive, between being curious and being cruel. And I crossed into territory that wasn't mine to cross. The other hosts added their thoughts. Whoopi talked about the importance of respecting guests' boundaries. Sarah mentioned the responsibility that comes with having a platform. Sunny discussed the broader implications for how media treats public figures. It was a meaningful conversation, the kind that might not have happened without this incident forcing it into the open. Meanwhile, Keanu's phone hadn't stopped. Friends checking in, family calling to make sure he was okay, professional contacts reaching out with support. But also strangers, people who'd somehow gotten his number or found ways to contact him, wanting to share their own stories or simply say thank you. One message in particular stuck with him. It was from a young woman who'd been in an abusive relationship and had struggled for years with people asking her why she stayed, what had happened, whether she'd provoked it. All the invasive questions that trauma survivors face. She said watching Keanu walk away had given her permission to do the same in her own life. To stop answering questions that hurt her. To stop performing her pain for other people's curiosity. That message made him cry, not from sadness, but from the realization that his moment of self-protection had somehow helped someone else find theirs. That standing up for his boundaries had given permission to others to stand up for theirs. It made the discomfort worthwhile. His agent called 3 days later with interesting news. The incident hadn't hurt his career the way some people might have feared. If anything, it had enhanced his reputation. Scripts were coming in from directors who wanted to work with someone who had that kind of integrity. Producers were reaching out with projects. The movie he'd been promoting was getting more attention than it might have otherwise, with people supporting it specifically because they supported him. You did something rare, his agent told him. You reminded people why they love you. Not because you're in action movies or because you do cool stunts. Because you're decent. Because you stand for something. The movie opened 2 weeks later to strong numbers. Reviews were positive. Audiences showed up. At the premiere, reporters asked him about the View incident, and he handled it the way he handled everything, with grace and minimal fuss. I think we all learned something from that situation, he said. About boundaries, about respect, about how we treat each other. I hope the conversation that came out of it does some good. That became the prevailing narrative. Not Keanu the diva who walked out, but Keanu the person who sparked an important conversation. Articles were written about the changing landscape of celebrity interviews. Studios started implementing new guidelines about what topics were off-limits, without explicit prior consent. Some shows began doing more thorough pre-interviews to understand where guests' boundaries were. It wasn't a revolution exactly, but it was progress. Small shifts in how these things were done, more consideration given to the human on the other side of the questions. And if Keanu had played some small role in making that happen, well, maybe the discomfort had been worth it. 3 months later, he was doing another interview for a different project. Different show, different hosts, but the same basic setup. Sitting on a couch, promoting his work, answering questions. At one point, the interviewer started to ask something personal, then caught himself. Actually, is that okay to ask about? The host said. I want to make sure I'm respecting your boundaries. Keanu appreciated that more than the host probably knew. I'd rather keep that private if that's all right. Absolutely, the host said immediately, and moved on to the next question without any awkwardness or pushback. That was the difference. That was the change. Small maybe, but real. People were thinking more carefully about what they asked and whether they had the right to ask it. They were remembering that the person in front of them was more than content for their show. They were human, with feelings and limits and the right to privacy about things that hurt. Keanu never spoke directly with Joy again, though he bore her no ill will. She'd apologized publicly and, he'd heard, had been genuinely shaken by the whole experience. He hoped she'd learned from it the way he'd learned from it. That they'd both come out of it as better, more thoughtful versions of themselves. As for the View incident itself, it became one of those moments that people remembered. The day Keanu Reeves walked out. The day someone finally said enough. It was talked about in journalism schools as a case study, referenced in articles about interview ethics, brought up whenever conversations turned to how the media treats public figures. But for Keanu, it became something simpler. A reminder that being kind didn't mean being a doormat, that protecting yourself wasn't selfish, that sometimes the most graceful thing you could do was walk away. He'd spent decades being accommodating, being easy, being the nice guy who never caused problems. And he would continue to be those things because they were genuinely part of who he was. But he'd also be someone who knew his limits and honored them. Someone who understood that true kindness included being kind to yourself. Someone who could say no when no needed to be said, and stand up when standing up mattered. The interview had lasted less than 30 minutes from start to finish. The walkout itself had taken maybe 60 seconds, but the impact rippled outward in ways none of them had anticipated that morning. Changing conversations, shifting expectations, reminding people that behind every famous face was a person with a right to privacy, dignity, and respect. And sometimes, all it took was one person being willing to say enough and meaning it. One person choosing their peace over their performance. One person remembering that some stories were theirs to keep, and that kindness, real kindness, had to include kindness to yourself. Keanu had done that. And in doing so, he'd given countless others permission to do the same. That more than any movie or stunt or performance might be the thing he was most proud of. The day he walked away, and in walking away, walked towards something better.